Okay, welcome again, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today at the Cal OES Sexual Assault Training Standards, Materials, and Methods, Session 3. We are kicking off Session 3 of our 5-part web series today. Thanks so much for being with us on Friday afternoon. Again, my name is Sarah Orton. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a project coordinator with the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Today for session 3, we will be covering 2 units as we do each session. Folks should know the drill by now. Today we will be talking about Unit E, which is crisis intervention, and Unit F, which is resources and referrals. Just a reminder, we will be training on the standards, which you can find in this hard copy of the trainer's guide, which should have been mailed out to each of your agencies. We have also sent out electronic copies of that. So please feel free to follow along. This is the book that we'll be working out of for our session today and the remainder of our series. Just a quick reminder that we do have a curriculum in the works. We will be doing a future training on that at a yet to be determined date and location. So today and for the remainder of this series, we're really just focusing on the standards to achieve compliance for the sexual assault counselor certification training through Cal OES. And we'll be talking about activities and implementation and everything like that at another time. Learning objectives for session 3. We are hoping after today, folks will be able to focus their efforts on building the advocate's capacity to provide crisis intervention and culturally competent resources and referrals. So it's twofold there. And also, we're hoping that folks will be able to describe strategies to achieve compliance with the standards in units E and F in the California Sexual Assault Training Standards Guide. So it is very important to us that we are checking these boxes, that we are accomplishing our learning objectives. We'll be sending out a survey at the end. So please do let us know how we did in meeting these objectives and any other feedback that you think would be helpful for us to know. We are kind of designing these sessions as we go along. Everything is tweakable. So if there's something that you didn't see today that would be helpful for you in achieving these objectives in subsequent sessions, please do let us know. We do review that feedback and take it really seriously and make those changes, implementation changes when we can. So I'll drop that in the chat at the end. Okay. So let's go ahead and jump into our first question. So we would like to know, and if you could please indicate in the chat and let us know, do your volunteer advocates conduct thorough needs assessments? So what we have to choose from is yes, maybe you have a standardized form with a bunch of check boxes that every advocate, as they respond to the hospital or take a crisis line call, goes through with folks, basic needs, emergency needs, etc. Maybe kind of so-so. Advocates are trained to ask some basic questions, but nothing super extensive or in depth. Maybe that's left more to the staff advocates, or no volunteer advocates who are responding to the hospital are not conducting any needs assessment. Those are only conducted by staff advocates, or you're not sure, or something else. So please go ahead and let us know in the chat how your agency is doing it. So Mark says staff only. Therapists do that more at intake. Yeah, so basic intake, basic questions by advocates in an informal sense. So not a standardized form. Needs assessments by staff only. Therapists do assessments, kind of. So doing some needs assessment to make sure that folks have their basic needs met. So I'm seeing a lot of folks that have therapists do assessments, staff only. So far, I don't think we've had anyone say that their volunteer advocates are actually doing thorough needs assessments when they go out. 50-50. Okay, yes, so maybe CPAF does have the proper intake form for survivors using internal database. Gotcha. Michael says that they have a standardized form that is reviewed by staff. Yeah, lots of assessment happening at the at intake. Okay. Okay, great. Thanks so much for letting us know, folks. We'll be talking about needs assessments today and a little bit more about what we mean by that. So it's always interesting to get sort of an overview of what it is folks are already doing at their organizations. Okay, we're going to answer this question in the chat as well. Does your sexual assault counselor training currently address responding to sexual exploitation? And the reason that we're asking this question today is that this is actually one of the new standards that is different from the last time the standards were put out in 2011. So this is new, appearing in our training standards guide for the first time. But I have a suspicion that so many of you, are already training on this topic. So it would be good to know. So yes, advocates are trained on identification and intervention. Kind of, it touches on sex trafficking, human trafficking, but advocates aren't typically specially trained on how to ask questions or how to intervene, or no, folks aren't addressing it, or you're not sure. Let's see, we have a busy chat. Yes, 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 many yeses. Yeah, so, okay. Yeses across the board. That's what I thought. So that's great. Okay, we have a couple kind of, not specially trained, definitely mentioned as being something that folks might encounter perhaps, but those intervention skills aren't necessarily honed. Okay, a couple yeses, but I think we can improve. Okay, awesome. So it's good to see that so many folks are already on the track to doing that, for being in compliance with that standard. So this is something else that we'll be addressing today and perhaps lingering on just a little bit more since this is one of our new standards that we're seeing here. Okay, so that brings us to Unit E, crisis intervention. So like I said, I believe that this is the longest unit. It's a minimum of 6 hours to cover everything in here, which is quite a bit. The media allowable, if you were to do 6 hours of training, is 36 minutes. Just a reminder that that's if, it was spread out across or distributed evenly rather than, across all of the units. And so you can obviously mix and match. Perhaps you won't use as much media for resources and referrals unit, and you can use this a little bit more here. And this unit does require a subject matter expert. So we'll be talking about that. We'll be doing kind of a group brainstorm around who folks are currently using, who you think you might be able to use when we talk about assessment and suicidality. Hi, Shelby.
Hi, Sarah. I can take over the screen sharing if you want.
Okay, cool. Yeah, let's do that. I am pulling up your name and I will make you a co-host. That was super great timing because we're just getting into the units now. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and I will let you take over again. Very much appreciated.
Great. Uh-oh. Did you already get to this slide?
Yeah, we're on, can't remember what number it is. I'm looking right now. It's on Unit E, crisis intervention. It's the title slide. It's slide number 72.
Okay.
Okay, are we good to go?
Yep.
Okay, all right, next slide, please. So these are some of our desired outcomes and key concepts for advocates. Again, we do this at every unit, but this is what we want advocates to be walking away with, being able to do, what competencies, et cetera, following the completion of Unit E. So following the completion of this unit, advocates should have developed skills for a trauma-informed, strengths-based approach to working with survivors and their support networks while upholding confidentiality and privilege. So these are all things that we're going to cover that I suspect y'all are already covering in your trainings. Additionally, advocates should acquire the skills necessary for addressing systemic and institutional barriers that impede survivors' access to services, justice, and healing, as well as developing collaborative action plans with survivors. Advocates should also develop coping skills for addressing vicarious trauma. So we'll talk about that a little bit as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so our first major header in this section is survivor-centered and trauma-informed principles and techniques. So coming straight from the standards, one of the first things that we want to make sure that folks are addressing with the advocates are a survivor-centered approach. Right, survivor-centered approaches center the needs of survivors. This is where we use empowerment models of advocacy rather than saviorism or rescuism models of advocacy. A huge part of this is allowing folks to choose their own course of action, which helps restore a sense of power and making sure that advocates really have the skills to be able to do that. They also need, privacy and confidentiality. Non-discrimination, of course, as we talked about in the anti-discrimination and oppression unit. But really what this looks like, I think, in practice is advocates being able to be aware of their own biases and own limitations in providing services to survivors. So it's important that we consider that when we think about centering the survivor, right, rather than, a self-centered approach. And survivors also need enough information to be able to make decisions that have informed consent, right, and are not told what to do. So really, our advocates are just there to be, I used to, when I was an advocate and would respond to the hospital, I used to tell folks to think of me as their personal assistant for the night as we were going through the exam process and things like that. So advocates, really need to be super aware of everything that a survivor center approach entails. Services should be trauma informed. Of course, this is a word that we say a lot. What does this mean in practice? Of course, it means that advocates really need to understand the impact of trauma, short-term and long-range effects of trauma, and of course, even the neurophysiology of trauma, how this impacts the brain, how this impacts memory and the moment, right? We'll be talking a little bit about this when we talk about resources and referrals and developing an action plan. But those things are huge. Giving referrals that avoid re-traumatization is also super important. So advocates should be really well trained on providing referrals that are, culturally competent, that are responsive, that are relevant for folks and aren't going to, be re-traumatizing. And also really being aware of that power imbalance that's inherent in an advocate and survivor situation, and take concrete steps to try and dismantle that hierarchy a little bit and sort of flatten the curve there. A couple key points that are important to cover, mainly around what an advocate is and what an advocate is not. An advocate, as we know, is not being a friend, it's not being a therapist. What it is validating feelings, finding strengths, and providing information so that folks can make the decisions that are right for them. So also super important to cover that because a lot of well-intentioned folks will move into advocacy roles that aren't super appropriate. And so we want to make sure folks are really aware of what roles they're leaning into in that moment. A quick note on boundaries. There's, I think, so much that we could talk about with boundaries. Something that it particularly says in the training standards that I'll uplift here because I think it's really important is this concept of self-disclosure, right? So for all of us who have done advocacy work, who have seen clients before, who have responded to the hospital or answered a crisis line before, know that inevitably at some point, usually sooner rather than later, a survivor will ask, has this happened to you? Have you been assaulted? And as providers, we're put in a really tricky situation because, what they're looking for in that moment is comfort, is a feeling that they're not alone. And, I think there's something in us that obviously really wants to meet that need. But what that does with self-disclosure is, it then turns it back over to us. It puts the emphasis on our stories and our experiences. The survivor, if we do share what our experiences have been like, if, we are survivors, if we chose to report or if we didn't choose to report, the the survivor might feel pressure to emulate our choices, and that's just really a whole mess that we want to stay away from. So we really need to work with our advocates in helping them understand why we really avoid self-disclosure, and really work with them to do some role plays, to do some thinking through what are other ways that we can meet that need, what are other ways that we can make the survivor know that they're not alone without sharing our own stories. Okay, so reviewing the techniques of active listening. These are, just the basics. Everything you're already doing, I'm sure, but we want to make sure that we're hitting on points like mirroring language, not naming survivors' experiences for them. We want to avoid something that I like to call fire hosing. I don't know if I made it up or if anyone else says that. I can't remember where I heard it. But fire hosing is sometimes this thing that we do as advocates where we have like so much information, we have so much to share with them, and we talk really fast and we just try to get it out all at once. And we're like, well, you can do this, you can do this, you can do this. And it just kind of feels like they're being fire hosed, with all of this information, with everything that we have to share. And so we really want to avoid that, and and spend more time listening and being deliberate and thoughtful and helping your advocates to understand, there might be a lot of resources that you don't share. There might be a lot of information that you don't get to because the situation demanded something else, and that's okay. Also, we want folks to be super aware of things like body language, etc. So something to practice with folks as well. And then just a couple last points that we want to be sure that we're hitting on from the standards are, making sure advocates know to get rid of distractions. Obviously, we want to put devices away. We want to be, not sitting there and reading a book. We want to make sure that that advocates know that when they're, sitting with someone, that their full attention is on that person, or if they're on the phone with someone, that their full attention is on that person. We want to, get folks in this habit of really focusing and really listening on what the survivor is saying, and not focusing on what us as the advocate is going to say next. I feel like I've seen this a lot. I feel like I probably did this a lot. I definitely did this a lot when I was a newer advocate, like really just, problem solving and thinking of my next move, and thinking what I was going to say next. And I think it requires some amount of training for folks, for advocates, to really just be present and intentional in that moment. So I wanted to note that. Obviously, we want advocates to be trained to listen for tone, to know what different affect means, to know how to, tell if somebody is being re-traumatized, if somebody withdraws all of a sudden, what does that mean? If somebody's tone changes, what does that mean? Things like that. We want, again, to really encourage folks to think before they speak, and to be really deliberate and intentional, and take their time in their resource and service provision. We want to hammer out advocates giving advice, right? And again, I'm sure that this is something that folks focus on a lot, because we say it all the time when we talk about empowerment-based models of advocacy, but they're not there as advisors. And I think that that's also something that requires a lot of skill around providing information in a way that really does come across as non-biased and objective. And of course, we want to make sure that we're helping them with some language tweaks that can be really important. We want to make sure that we're practicing phrases like help me understand, or I get the feeling that, or I'd like to hear more, rather than, what? Or, oh, you said that you wanted. So really just like those language tweaks and having folks actually practice that and get in the habit of that is something important too. Can we do next slide, please, Shelby? Awesome, thank you. So next we'll look at needs assessment and survivor options. The few things that we want to make sure that folks are assessing for that are outlined in the standards, I'll just kind of name them off. One, assess for immediate needs. That can look like a lot of things, but immediate needs, I think we're kind of thinking along the lines of like emergency physical services, things like that. Assess for basic needs, things like food, shelter, clothing. We have to make sure that folks' basic needs are met before we can, expect them to effectively do trauma work, to process trauma. We also want to assess for personal strengths, right? Again, kind of going back to strength-based and empowerment models of advocacy. We really want to be aware of as their advocate and help them to realize too what personal strengths that they currently have that are going to be a real resource for them during this time, including support systems. Perhaps. Advocates should also be trained to assess for physical and cognitive ability. It's just important information to have, particularly as they're if they're at the hospital and interfacing with or sort of mitigating interaction between the person and other providers. And lastly, it's really important that advocates are trained to assess the need for translation and make sure that they know exactly what to do if they walk into a room and meet with somebody and they do not speak the same language as that person. They need to know how they're going to get translation services. Again, important that advocates aren't translators. And same thing if they get a call on the hotline with someone who they don't have a language in common with. Some options for survivors. We're going to highlight some of the things that need to be addressed in the training standards. Option, of course, is reporting to law enforcement. It's also an option to not report to law enforcement. There are medical services available that advocates need to be able to describe, including medical evidence collection, but also medical exams to assess for physical safety, for STI prevention, for things like that. And advocates need to know that they can tell survivors that they can sort of pick and choose what they engage in and what they don't, is that it's not all about the evidence collection, or at least it doesn't have to be, or it can be. VAWA says that survivors can get exams without participating from law enforcement due to a California penal code, which I do not have memorized. So making sure that folks understand that they can get the medical part without having to cooperate with law enforcement and investigation. Advocates should also know to tell folks that counseling is in no way contingent on filing a report. The advocate should also let folks know, that themselves as the advocate has really zero stakes on whether they report or not, that they're eligible for services just the same no matter what they choose to do. There's also a form that Cal OES developed in 2012 that is for survivors who are uncertain about whether or not they want to use law enforcement in their process. And this form defines what evidence needs to be preserved, et cetera. So that's something that advocates should be aware of as well. And again, what that form is and all of these penal codes are inside of the training standards guide. So you don't need me to tell you what they are right now. Also, third-party reporting is something that advocates should be aware of. Again, you can look more into that in the standards. They'll have some more detail there. And the last note is just to be mindful, or have advocates know to be mindful of jurisdictions. If you're a large agency that's serving, numerous jurisdictions or areas, because sometimes things can change a little bit depending on that. So just something to be mindful of. And lastly, discussing the development of an action plan. Advocates should prioritize short and long-term actions. They should make sure everything is accessible and one place for the survivor. Something that we know, speaking of why it's important to understand the neurophysiology of trauma and the effects on the brain, is that we know that when someone is in acute crisis, their memory isn't working properly. Things aren't being encoded into memory as they should. So just telling someone, oh, you should call this resource in the morning, is not something that's going to stick with them. So it's really important that advocates know that they should come prepared to write everything down, to write a thorough plan, to make sure phone numbers and documents and everything that someone might need for follow-up the next day is all in one place and easy for the survivor to find. So I'm a big fan of, drawing lists and charts and whatever else it is that folks need so that they can look at it the next day if they need to, as if they're seeing it for the first time. And then of course, it's important for the advocate to be really aware of what the follow-up and agency protocol is, so they can say, this is the first time or the last time that you and I will be meeting because I'm a crisis responder, but a staff advocate from such and such organization will be calling you in the next 3 days to check on you. Would that be okay? So making sure that they're well versed in that as well. Next slide, please, Shelby. Okay, so suicide lethality and safety assessments and interventions, a subject matter expert, such as a suicide prevention team, is required for this section. So we'll be talking about who that could be in just a couple moments. Okay, so make sure that advocates know how to assess is really kind of the bottom line here. Make sure that they know to ask about a plan, make sure that they know to ask about previous thoughts or attempts, any medications that the survivor is on and why. Make sure that they know the agency protocol for suicidality in their sleep. This is so important because, like I just said, neurophysiology of trauma is an advocate is receiving a disclosure of suicidality, of suicidal thoughts that could send that person into crisis, right? And their kind of memory could go offline, and so we want it to be, not just something that's given to them and oh yeah, read this. We really want them to know it so well that they'll know how to do that policy if in a crisis situation. So I think that that's really important. A couple notes about intervention. Again, it's important to respond using the agency protocol and educating folks on risk factors and warning signs, things like that, to be a little bit prepared. But options include things like a suicide prevention contract, a suicide plan, who's going to call, so make sure, or who the person is going to call who's experiencing suicidality, et cetera. So making sure that advocates know about that is also really important. And just lastly, like I just said, this can be, receiving disclosures of suicidality can be really traumatizing for advocates, especially new folks. And so be sure to let them know where they can debrief if they need to check in with a supervisor after, or, things like that. So, so make sure that you have that protocol really spelled out for them, that they know they can call and get support, that they know, some things that they can do for self-care and things like that. Next slide, please. Okay, confidentiality, like a totally straightforward, not at all nuanced topic. So confidentiality in actuality is really one of the trickiest issues, but generally speaking, the thing for advocates to know is that anything said by a victim survivor to a sexual assault counselor is confidential and privileged based on a California penal code. It's also important that advocates, are honest with survivors about their confidentiality limitations. I will let y'all know really quick, just a couple of sort of high level exceptions that we want to make sure the advocates are aware of. Obviously, confidentiality is broken if the person signs a release, right? We're going to talk about release of information when we talk about referrals. We might need to, in order to do a warm referral, share some information about a client, and that's all fine and good if they sign a release for us to do so. Another exception is if another person is present, the judge issues an order if that person is a danger to their self or others. Some instances for mandated reporting, which we talked a little bit about in session 2 during child sexual abuse and teen sexual abuse. And again, it's important for them to know the agency protocol here and to always defer to that and make sure that that protocol is somewhere accessible for them as well. Can we do the next slide, please? Okay, crisis intervention with significant others. I know a lot of folks who find themselves being the most challenged in working with family members and significant others of survivors. Sometimes it can be really challenging. There's a subheader in here that says the counselor/advocate should. So there's a couple of things that we just want to make sure that folks know. And we talked about this with teen sexual abuse. To be aware of those dual roles. So the bottom line is that the advocate is the advocate to survivor and only to the survivor. Sometimes the best thing that you can do for a survivor is to calm their significant other and family members. I'm sure that we've all been in those situations where, a mom or a partner or a family member is having a much, much harder time than the person who was assaulted, right? And survivor is like, I'm chill. Like, I just need to do my thing. I need to, get my exam, and family members are spinning out of control. And so I have been in situations in which I've probably spent more time with family members doing crisis intervention, but really it was centering the best interest of the survivor, right? That was the kindest and most helpful thing I could do for them at that point. So that's fine and good. And an advocate should know that, just as long as they're always operating from the place of best interest for the survivor. It can also be helpful to tell significant others how to act, what to expect. This is what, this is what survivor might act like when they come home. This is what they might need. Here are some things that you can say. Here are some things that you should really never say. Giving them kind of a psychoeducation on trauma. All of these things can be helpful, and an advocate should be trained how to do that. Advocates should also be aware, that they can make referrals for family members too. Family members, significant others are also eligible for counseling. So make sure that they know that they can do that. Next slide, please. Okay, so here for continuing support. Obviously, it's important to have a continuum of care. It's important to discuss the importance of continuing support with survivor. So I kind of mentioned this before. So while you're discussing the need for continued support, it's good for the advocate to be trained and have some language around this really being the first and last time that they're going to be able to meet with survivor, and what follow-up is going to look like from the organization. I know, folks might do it a little bit differently, but I'm making the assumption that pretty much everybody that volunteer advocates don't carry caseloads, right? That it's really just that one time for crisis intervention, and that's it. So, they need to have some language around describing that and how follow-up and continuum of care is going to work in that situation. And, of course, a balance is needed between encouraging follow-up and pushing it. So they need some training around the nuance of that as well. Is going to be really important. In terms of exploring options, assessing options, and making a plan, make a follow-up plan. That's basically all there is to it. Make a plan and do hand-to-hand referrals. We'll be talking about cold referrals versus warm referrals and the importance of that. So make sure that they have, some good training and information around that as well. Okay, next slide. All right, so identifying and responding to sex trafficking. As I said before, this is actually a new section, a new requirement in 2020. And these are the kind of high-level concepts that you want to make sure that you're addressing with folks. So these are the 3 subheaders that are in the standards. So key statistics, a lot of the sections require key statistics. It's nice that the trainer's guide actually offers statistics. Stats can be really important to show prevalence, but for whatever reason, human trafficking stats can often be really overinflated, and we don't want to perpetuate bad research just to make a point. So it's nice that they have some statistics for you in there, assuming that they stay current and everything. questions for the survivor. So these are some questions. There's examples of specific questions in there, which I'll give some examples of in just a moment, that advocates can ask survivors if they suspect sex trafficking or some other kind of human trafficking is taking place. It's important to have them be aware of the fact that asking some of these questions is going to produce more positive results rather than, you're not going to straight up ask somebody if they're a victim of human trafficking, particularly not in that language. What we know about survivors of trafficking is that they usually don't self-identify as victims. And so advocates really need to know what questions to ask to really draw out that information. And also here, it's important, I think, to be extra, extra careful not to name experiences for someone. Again, the point really is to make the best referral, to provide stabilization, not to save anyone or rescue anyone. And I think that centering those points can be really important. Again, if somebody discloses that they're participating in consensual sex work, we really want to make sure that we're, not making situations into something based on our own values or our own beliefs, that it's not what the survivor is explicitly telling us. And I know that advocates, folks who are newer to the work, can sometimes have a really hard time with that and really respecting those boundaries. So I think that in this section, if nothing else, that's really the most important thing to hone in on and hone skill around for folks. So a couple of questions that, we want advocates to kind of have in their back pocket to be ready to ask if they are suspecting that there's a trafficking situation. They might ask, can you come and go as you please? Can you come and go from home as you please? Do you get paid for your work? Are you being forced to do anything that you don't want to do? Are you or your family being threatened? Do you live with your employer? Do you owe debt to your employer? So things like that. And clearly I think that we wouldn't just like go down a checklist and ask all of those questions, but those are some things that can kind of be peppered into the conversation that might give the advocate a better idea. And again, we want to know this information because we want to make the best referral and meet someone's needs as fully as we're able to. And then lastly, and by the looks of it, it seems like most folks are doing this. Review signs with advocates that are listed in the training standards. So the ones that are listed here are information about work and living conditions, poor mental health or abnormal behavior, poor physical health, lack of control. And lastly, there is some information about next steps for if a counselor or advocate suspects that someone is a victim of human trafficking. And a lot of that is going to have to do with like your region and agency protocol and things like that. Can we do next slide? Uh-oh. Lost our slides. Looks like we lost Shelby, but that's okay because we are about to go into our breakout room. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my slides. So role plays are also super important. I know everybody knows that. And again, just because, it's recommended in the standards, it's really important to draw from your own center's crisis intervention experiences with crisis line calls and in-person meetings with survivors and accompaniments and advocacy services and all of the client interfacing things to create scenarios for participants to role play in. And, I really think it's super important to have role plays really be something that's utilized for everything that we just discussed about crisis intervention and all of the different populations and all of the nuances. And I just think, being able to practice active listening and to practice saying, saying different phrases and describing services and things like that is just really so invaluable to folks being able to do it when they're in a really highly emotionally charged situation. I mean, again, until someone is so practiced at this and has been on dozens of accompaniments, We have advocate and survivor who are, who are both in the room together or on the phone together in this highly charged, highly emotional state. And so I think the more that we can make, the crisis intervention practices just second nature, just muscle memory, it's really going to be such a smoother and more effective process for everybody involved. And here are some additional topic considerations. So these are actually not in the training standards. You won't find them in the training standards, but you will find them in the Cal OES application. So it does say, in the application, there's a little bar for additional topic considerations. Not all of the units have them, but this is one of the units that does have them. So again, these aren't requirements. These are just things that you might want to consider addressing. So counselor safety, advocate safety, I would recommend addressing that, super important. Particularly agency protocols around safety, I think are important for volunteer advocates to know. Self-care, how to take care of oneself, and vicarious trauma. And I think, vicarious trauma and self-care are interlinked, of course, and those two things would likely go together. A quick note on vicarious trauma is, when I went through the California sexual assault training many, many years ago for the first time and started working as an advocate, I had been working as a volunteer and then as a staff advocate for 3 years, I think, before I heard the word vicarious trauma, and I got hired at a different organization. I went to that organization, and in their training, their 40-hour training, they did address vicarious trauma. And when the facilitator was giving that presentation, all of the, kind of the checklist that she had up there for signs of burnout or vicarious trauma, I was like, that's me. This person is describing me. And I had no idea that those things were perfectly normal. I was able to get help that I needed to get. I was able to, change my practice a little bit. I, am embarrassed to say now, but I didn't know what that was. And, I just, I still think in the beginning would have been, it would have been such a helpful preventative in not getting to a place of burnout had I been aware enough to, or aware of rather the signs and symptoms and things like that earlier. So just personal anecdote there, I would definitely recommend talking about that, even if just briefly. Okay, so we are going to head to some breakout rooms. And to stop sharing my screen to do that. Welcome back, Shelby. I will co-host you again in just a moment. Okay, so we have about 50 folks. We are going to go into breakout rooms for 7 minutes with about 3 or 4 folks each. Shelby, are you able to pull the slides and put the prompt in the chat while I have breakout rooms? Cool.
There you go.
Awesome. So we are going to talk in our breakout rooms. What are some examples of subject matter experts who could train advocates on suicide prevention? So are you currently using subject matter experts? If so, who are you using? Not, get some ideas for who you could use, and we'll come back and share ideas in about 7 minutes. So let me get us into our rooms. Okay, so we'll automatically close after 7 minutes. You will have a 60-second warning. Okay, I'm gonna open the rooms. You should get a notification that pops up on your screen to join the room, and we'll see you back here in 7 minutes. Welcome back, folks. Welcome back from your breakout rooms. Excuse me. Just resumed recording. We see that folks are coming back to the group. We're still waiting on, I think, about maybe 10 to 14 or so folks. But if you wanted to go and get started, Shelby, can I see the next slide, please? So yeah, please share some discussion highlights in the chat. What did you all talk about? Who are you using as subject matter experts? Who do you think you could use as subject matter experts? And again, this is for Unit E, crisis intervention and suicidality assessment and intervention. So Katie says QPR does their suicide prevention training. Mark has County Behavioral Health. So Carolyn asks a good question. If we have someone on staff who is part of a hotline for a number of years and they teach the class, does that count as an expert or must it be an outside expert? Leah and I were actually talking about this recently, and I cannot remember where exactly we landed. I think that I did not find specification for that anywhere in the standards, reviewing them. However, I do think that the spirit of the thing is to have someone who's outside, or maybe someone who's a licensed clinical therapist, but somebody who's a little bit more credentialed than someone who's been a hotline volunteer. Great. Any other ideas, suggestions, questions? Also, please feel free to raise your hand and unmute if you have something that you'd like to share that you don't want to put in the chat. So it looks like a lot of people are using behavioral health. Is anyone using a LCSW or any other licensed clinical people, therapists? Cindy says that the local suicide prevention service provider is the outside expert but for crisis intervention, we as in staff are the experts, so we don't use an outside expert. Yeah, Cindy, that's a good way of putting it. I think that that's exactly right. So for the suicide piece, it's good to have someone we used to use local suicide prevention team as well. Jasmine says that their clinical director and LCSW conduct the training. Great. Christina says, yes, we have a past volunteer who is now an LMFT and a PhD who does a portion of the training. Okay, great. So there's a lot of creativity, a lot of different ways. It doesn't sound like anyone is having a particularly challenging time accessing a subject matter expert for this section. Is anyone feeling like, I don't know where we're going to get a subject matter expert for this, or, we're currently using someone and I think we need to be using someone else? Any questions or concerns? Carolyn, you're mildly concerned. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate the honesty. I'm sorry that you're mildly concerned. Please let us know if there's anything that we can do on this call today to help alleviate your concern. Does anyone have any questions about anything else that we talked about in Unit E? Any questions, comments before we wrap up this unit? Thoughts?
Katie says she has a question. She says, are we able to pull from the standard training and having to use it as a resource?
I don't know that I totally understand the question. I'm sorry. Are we able to pull from the standard training and having to use you as a resource we pulled it from? Sorry, Katie, are you able to clarify, or you can let me know if you need help unmuting if you'd like to do that. Are we able to pull information from the training and reference you as a resource? As a resource for whom? As a resource for the training material. I I still am not sure that that I'm totally following, but yeah, I think the answer is yes. We're you're having a hard time unmuting, so
Hi, I'm the co-trainer with her.
okay.
So I will try to interpret. I'm not sure if I know what she's saying either, but I think just like the books that CalCASA sent out, we can pull, these are meant that we can pull information from these and utilize them in our trainings and list CalCASA as the source.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yes, 100%.
I think that's what, I hope that's what Katie's asking. Okay. Yes. Okay. Sounds
Okay.
good.
Cool. Yes. Yeah. This is what this guide is. That is what it is for. They, this and the training standards application should be your like holy books through this process. And yeah, feel free always to reference or resource. And also feel free, you have both Leah and my contact information. So if you have any other specific questions or are not sure or need follow-up TA around any of this, please don't hesitate to reach out to us via email either, just so you know. Thank you, Katie. Thanks, Liz, for your translation. Any other questions or comments or thoughts, hopes or dreams before we go to break? Okay, so we are 4 minutes early for our break. How delightful is that? It appears as if I have lost my break time slide, so I will get that back in there really quick. So we have that up. But please break for 10 minutes. Please come back at 2:21 and we will get started again then. Okay, welcome back. It is 2:21. That was a quick 10 minutes. So we're going to go ahead and jump back in. Hopefully everyone is returned and ready and getting settled. I see that we have a question or comment from Sonia in the chat that we'll address really quick. Sonia says, I would like to know what other centers are giving for manuals and if anyone is going to give out new support for survivors and can that be done. We always give out a binder with some of the support for survivors information and also include the speaker handouts in the binder and would like to cut down on making so many copies. So we do have, I can say the CalCASA, the new support for survivors manual looks like this. Shelby, have these been sent out? Do you know?
Yes, every member center should have received that, the training standards, and the facilitator's guide.
Okay, great. So yeah, you should be able to distribute these as well. But yeah, folks have answers for what they're doing. And obviously there's going to be a lot of like agency specific roll calls and, and maybe folks like to give copies of slides. And I know everyone does it a little bit differently. So please feel free to respond to Sonia's question in the chat. Okay, can we do next slide, please? Okay, so we're going to dive right into Unit F, referral, resources, and methods. I always feel like that's kind of a tongue twister. Maybe that's just me. So, okay, the time to complete this unit is minimum 1 hour, so not too long at all. Went from like the longest unit to the shortest unit. Media allowable is 6 minutes, of course. If you were doing the session for 60 minutes, that would be 10%. And excuse me, a subject matter expert is not required for this section. So can I see the next slide, please, Shelby? So these are some of the desired outcomes and key concepts. Again, these are for volunteer advocates, what we want folks to be, what competencies we want them to have after the completion of this unit. Advocates should be able to identify needed support services to be provided by community resources other than those delivered by Rape Crisis Center, and work with survivors to create individualized, survivor-centered referral plans. So we'll be talking a lot throughout this section about community resources and what community resources you all use. We know that that depends so much on the region and the population and the service area. We do in the training standards, and we'll get to this in just a moment, have some suggestions of community partners that you might work with in providing services. But we just really wanted to highlight that Rape Crisis Center work isn't necessarily the end all be all. While we provide so much essential service. Obviously, not everybody has a shelter, not everybody has emergency food or clothing, lots of places do, but we wanna make sure that we're working in tandem with our community partners to get basic needs met and things like that as well. We wanna make sure that our advocates know how to activate those systems should a survivor need that. Additionally, advocates should be able to identify challenges that survivors may encounter with community, medical, and government referrals, including historical trauma and cultural barriers. I think that this is something that's really big too, because advocates really need to be aware of the fact that not every resource is a good fit for everyone, as it's a requirement to address special populations in each one of these units. We want to make sure that we're giving resources that are culturally sensitive and relevant. For example, folks are going to be working with survivors who are old enough to remember medical trauma, like Tuskegee trials, for example, right? And advocates need to be really aware of how limiting that can be in providing referrals that are actually safe or feel safe for the client to engage with. So we'll be talking about that as well. Can you see the next slide, please? So there are referral considerations, procedures, and access to local resources and referrals. There's kind of a basic formula here that's outlined in the training standards that we wanted to highlight. And that formula is identify need, discuss options, assess options, and make a plan. So again, training on that can look a lot of different ways, but we want to make sure that the baseline is that advocates are able to do that they're able to work with survivors to identify what their need or needs are. They're able to effectively discuss options, assess those options, and then make a plan. Lots to consider when making a referral list as well. So again, it's really important that advocates make sure that they're not giving resources or referrals that can be re-traumatizing. And obviously our job as trainers is to make sure that they have the tools to be able to do that. MOUs can be really helpful in this situation. MOUs help with service and vetting, right? So as you're vetting community partners or resources, you can always have MOUs that help, memorandums of understanding that can help, sort of vet the process a little bit and kind of the service standard that both partners have in their agreement. This can also, help circumvent a lot of red tape if you've already made the connection beforehand, if they're used to working with your organization, you're used to working with their organization, et cetera. So so having MOUs in place beforehand can really help kind of simplify the process, not only for survivors, but for the advocates who are making the referrals. If they're easily able to do a warm referral and call an organization and say, hello, I'm an advocate with such and such Rape Crisis Center. We have an MOU. This is what I need. They're able to, activate that system and just much more smoothly, I think. Can do next slide, please. So in the chat, we would like to hear from you all. Who are some of your most common referrals? Again, talking about local referrals, community organizations. We know that this, like I said before, really depends on the service area, whether folks are rural. In fact, I think it might be helpful as you're letting us know what your most common referrals are. Let us know whether your location is urban, suburban, or rural, and we can see together if we find any themes for what folks are referring. And again, there is a list in the training standards of some of the most common referrals, so you can look at those as well, just to jog some folks' memory perhaps. Healthcare facilities, social services, food banks, LGBTQIA plus service centers, independent living centers, consulates, perhaps. That was never a big thing for my referral list in any of the areas that I've worked. And I've worked a pretty broad in geographic location, worked in rural and urban and et cetera. So it'd be interesting to see if anyone is referring to consulates regularly. Obviously, substance abuse treatment facilities. When I worked in rural communities, detox has actually been really, really huge. Folks needing to go to detox, again, that's like a basic need before we expect folks to effectively do trauma work. We have faith-based organizations, legal aid, perhaps, that's usually another big one. Counseling services and support groups. I know a lot of times, obviously, rape crisis centers provide this, but a lot of times we have big wait lists and need to sometimes refer out to other organizations, or if folks have needs that the Rape Crisis Center just isn't qualified to meet in sort of mental and behavioral health stuff. Victim compensation, I'm sure it's a big one that everybody refers to. So let's see what's going on in the chat.
Yeah, I was just reading some of these. So I know Mark says that he's in a rural area, and a common referral for him is homeless shelters. Michael, who's in a suburban area, says medical, mental health, housing, and food are common referrals. Elizabeth says human services agency, victim or witness. Katie says the courthouse or SHARP, now that courts are closed. Michelle, who's in a rural area, says CSU, local shelters, food bank. Alexandra says family law, child custody and housing. Kelson in a suburban area says county DV agency, victim services, LGBT agency. Rocky says he's in a rural or frontier area. Jasmine says their location is urban, so they usually refer to other rape crisis centers, legal services, shelters, DMH, social services. Olivia says medical, legal aid, victim witness, DV agencies, social services, food banks, etc. Lynette, transgender health and wellness for LGBTQIA folks.
Yeah, and I want to lift that up too, because something like transgender health and wellness is a good example of a culturally relevant service, and folks who don't often work with trans folks or aren't part of that population. Trans folks, for example, are a population who have experienced a huge deal of medical trauma, right? And we might think, oh, we'll just refer folks to the free clinic because we refer everybody to the free clinic. But that can actually be really, really re-traumatizing for trans folks, particularly those who are early in their transition, things like that, or really just anyone. So we want to make sure that we're training our advocates to really think through those things, particularly as they're, we're never all part of the populations that we're serving 100% of the time. So having on your referral list something like specific trans health and wellness services is going to be super important, because you might have a survivor that's going to be much more likely to follow up with that resource, for example, if they have a pretty good feeling that they're not going to be re-traumatized. So stuff like that, that's a good example of some of the stuff that we want to be helping folks really think through and that we want to make sure we have on our referral list. Let's see. Yeah. So Michael also says, we do provide mental health counseling, but not for severe and persistent mental illness. That's a really big thing as well. I think that we comment a lot or run into a lot as, things like co-occurring disorders. And so it's important to have those referrals as well for more, compounding behavioral health issues. So yeah, anything else? Anyone have a referral that hasn't been covered yet that you've used or used all the time that you think is kind of missing from our cumulative brainstorm here? Okay, cool. And we'll wrap back around and revisit this in just a little bit. Can we do next slide, please, Shelby? So best practices and strategies for warm referrals and community referrals. How to make the most effective referrals. So this section, talks about cold referrals versus warm referrals. I'm sure folks know, but a cold referral is providing info about an agency and leaving someone to call all on their own, perhaps. So if I'm sitting with a client or on the phone with them and, I say, oh, you should really give, Transgender Health and Wellness Center a call tomorrow. I think that would be good for you. That's cold referral. Warm referral is when you're calling with people, and I'll address in just a moment that we know that this is not always possible after hours. There are ways to get creative. But for example, if I were sitting with a client or on the phone with a client or survivor, and I said, hey, it sounds like you can really benefit. I know the center, they're Transgender Health and Wellness. Let's call together. Is it okay for me to call on your behalf? And, kind of help them navigate things like voicemail mazes and, folks who are unhelpful and really all of these things that we encounter as service providers when we're making more referrals that can be so challenging and frustrating to actually get support that somebody needs. And then having that, be compounded by a survivor on their own, trying to, make these calls when they're in crisis mode is just not nearly as effective. Going back to the note about that this is not always possible after hours, particularly if someone's calling in the middle of the night. I mean, we know that so much of our work happens outside of the hours from 9 to 5, obviously. And so, a lot of times offices are closed, so that's not always possible to make that call. Your advocates can always have a voicemail on someone's behalf. The other thing that is really important is if they're leaving notes for the advocate, the staff advocate who's going to follow up with them. It's really important this is particularly when it's really important to have that good communication between advocates, where the crisis advocate, the volunteer advocate can, fill out their post accompaniment report or whatever it is that different folks use and say, hey, these are the referrals that I made. We weren't able to do warm referrals because it was after hours. I either called and left a voicemail, or, I told this person, we have permission, you can give them a call in the morning and you can, call this organization together. If there's any other creative ways that folks are doing warm referrals after hours in the middle of the night, please let us know in the chat. I, in preparation was trying to think of all of the ways which one could do this. And so I think that, as always, I'm one person with one lens and probably missing some stuff. So yeah, let us know. Okay, can we do, sorry, got one more barking dog. Also want to make sure that, sorry, give me one moment. I'm going to put the dog away. Sorry about that. He's so bad. Okay, so relevant resources for cultures. Obviously, I think, we've said about 100 times now, is making sure that resources are culturally relevant is really important. In your vetting process, vetting the Language services is going to be really important. Considerations for marginalized populations and generational trauma. I know that I mentioned this a bit at the top, but again, there's a lot of recent history of really problematic and really traumatizing practices, particularly perpetuated by healthcare systems, law enforcement systems, but also, you know, certain faith-based communities have experienced discrimination. Certain faith-based communities have perpetrated discrimination against queer and trans folks. So these are all the things that we have to be, all of the nuances that we have to have our advocates be trained to consider when making referrals, right? If we are, you know, we need to make sure that advocates aren't sending, for example, queer and trans people to organizations, to healthcare organizations that aren't vetted. You know, we have to make sure that advocates are, you know, really keeping in mind the violence experienced by people of color at the hands of healthcare systems and police and all of those things. So it's really it's really about the vetting. It's really a delicate dance, again, just like everything else, between making sure that advocates are trained to provide all the information, give someone all of the options, and at the same time, you know, take some care to make sure that those things are culturally competent and relevant. You know, it's also great if advocates are able to know about your vetting process, if you're able to, as you're training them. Michael says no conversion therapists. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I'm sure that that's happened. Michael, I'm sure that someone's accidentally sent a kid to a place that does conversion therapy. I mean, probably not often, but it's totally possible. So yeah, I'm sure that there's a lot of other examples as well. If anyone has any other ideas or like horror stories of referrals gone bad, please let us know in the chat if you're comfortable. And it's good if in your vetting process, you're able to let your advocates know, this is our referral list, we have vetted folks, so that your advocates, particularly your advocates who are part of marginalized communities as well, can feel really good about your vetting process and the referrals that they're making. Also, if advocates are aware of that, they can also reassure survivors that resources have been vetted to the best of their ability. As an advocate, I always love to be able to say, I've worked with this therapist a bunch of times. They're so great. We've sent folks to them before. And when I could really vouch for someone, it felt like a much more solid referral. I always felt very nervous the first couple of times that we were using a new resource or referral, or if, there was a need that wasn't on our referral list because it was something that we had never encountered a need for before. So I just want to stress that that's super important. It's super important for your advocates to be trained and kind of share in that knowledge with you as well. Advocates, this is kind of a small but also really big thing. It's important, that advocates don't provide, that they know that they cannot provide any identifying information without written consent of the survivor. And sometimes that can be really tricky on site, making warm referrals. And so you want to make sure, this is another area in which I think role plays might be really helpful in, figuring out if they don't have a consent form. And a lot of places, volunteer advocates aren't really authorized to do like release of information forms and stuff like that. And so, you can be doing, there are ways, doing warm referrals without an advocate, a volunteer advocate calling a place and saying, hi, I'm sitting with so-and-so. They were just sexually assaulted and this is what we need. So, so make sure that is somewhere in your training and that folks are super aware of the boundaries there. Next slide. Thanks, Shelby. Okay, so we are getting ready to head into our second breakout room or talk about resources and referrals. Before we head there, does anyone have any questions or comments? Please feel free to put in the chat or raise your hand or just simply unmute yourself. Okay, so in the breakout rooms, we will send you there again. We're gonna have a little bit bigger bigger breakout rooms this time, because we are going to do a share out actually when we come back to kind of close us out here. So please, in your groups, assign a note taker / reporter for the whole group share out. So that person will be responsible for kind of taking notes and capturing everyone's point during the breakout room. And then when we come back, that person will give sort of like a high level 30-second to 1 minute report about what was discussed in your group. So we're going to do a little bit of strategizing and brainstorming together. I'm going to go ahead and put the prompt in the chat since Shelby is sharing her screen. So please discuss the following. What are some barriers advocates should consider when offering community referrals to marginalized populations? So a lot of those things that we just discussed. And to what extent do partner organizations need to be vetted for cultural competence? So what are some considerations like those that we just discussed and more with specific populations perhaps? And to what extent do partner organizations need to be vetted for cultural competence? So I will go ahead and get those breakout rooms ready. Okay, and again, we will be in our breakout rooms for 7 minutes. And I'm opening those rooms now. So you should see an invitation on your screen. Please head to your breakout room. Looks like folks are coming back. Welcome back. So we only had 5 groups. We had to, some of you probably noticed getting shifted around in your breakout rooms just a little bit because we had some folks not join and some folks in by themselves. So thanks for your flexibility with that. So yeah, we should have 5 recorders and we have just about 8 minutes left before we close out our session. That actually reminds me, I'm going to go ahead and drop the survey link in the chat right now, and I'll do that a couple more times. But it's like a 2-minute survey. Like I said before, I super appreciate when folks fill it out because it's really helpful for us in designing future sessions. And yeah, just please let us know what worked really well, what would have been better in conveying some of this information. I know it's not, the most like riveting thing to talk about ever, but we try to be interactive and to, convey this information as comprehensively as we can. So please do let us know how we did on those learning objectives. Okay, can we get just volunteer, someone brave enough to start with this share out? Please go ahead and unmute yourself and yeah, just give us 30 seconds to a minute. What did y'all talk about? What are some barriers that advocates should consider when offering community referrals to marginalized populations?
Hi, this is Mark. There was 3 of us. A lot of times when the shelter's full and you have to, our shelter's full and you have to refer out, it was discussed about faith-based organizations, referring to a faith-based organization. Also, some shelters, there might not be some shelters at RCCs. That's a possibility. For vetting, since I'm a volunteer, I'm not quite sure what the staff does. There is one staff member that assembles the resource list, and so, but I'm not sure how much they vet that. So that's all we talked about.
Well, thank you so much.
This is Veronica from Community Violence Solutions in Contra Costa and Marin. And we talked about shelter, specifically if we have a trans person that is needing shelter and making sure that that shelter can accept them and not having them in a position where they're being humiliated or re-traumatized. We also talked about, I think everyone in our group said that we're updating our resource guide yearly and checking to make sure that it's always updated. We also talked about the fact that right now with the pandemic, that resources and referrals are going to be shifting and changing. And so it's super important to, I mentioned I don't trust any referral right now because, want to make sure that things are available, especially housing stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Veronica. That's all really helpful information. And 100%, I just want to lift up referring, trans and gender nonconforming folks to shelters that, are not previously vetted, that are binary, can be super re-traumatizing, super humiliating. So, so thanks for lifting that up.
Hi, everyone. This is Jacqueline from RCS Fresno. I was meeting with Cassandra and Elizabeth, and we touched on some of the same topics about faith-based referrals. Some clients may gravitate towards that, and others might be a little bit more hesitant. It depends on their attitudes and beliefs about faith-based organizations. We also had conversations about the trans non-conforming population and housing, emergency housing shelters. And we also discussed funding limitations, whether or not certain centers could accept SA survivors and victims when it's a DV specific shelter or agency.
Awesome. Yeah, good points. Thank you so much. Should have 2 more reporters.
Hi, this is Colleen from RTS. We discussed some of the barriers that we might confront our transportation. I know some agencies can't provide transportation for those folks who need to get somewhere, whether it's to your own counseling or to a different location, as well as financial and language barriers. Another thing that popped into my mind as I was listening to everyone else is there are some shelters that won't take families. They'll only take 1 or 2 people and not full families or after hours. I confronted that when I was back up on our crisis line. Someone needed a place to stay and the police weren't helping. And then the place that's supposed to help place them weren't helping either. So then there was that where you couldn't contact them after hours, and most places we found wouldn't take a full family. So those were the barriers that we kind of discussed in our group number 3.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, it's Giselle. My group talked about mental health barriers that may affect individuals and really being able to recognize their needs according to their mental wellness, and then also considering any trauma that they have been through, as well as their economic standings. And hearing from everybody else too, I also agree that there are barriers given like faith-based organizations and also organizations that may not accept people based on their gender identification.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everybody, for sharing and for your participation and for joining us today. Again, please take the survey. I am super shameless in my begging for people to take surveys. So please do. And we will see you back here on next Wednesday. I believe that is July 29th. For session number 4, and we will return after that for our last session on July 31st, which is a Friday. Again, both times are at 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. again. Please feel free to email me with questions, concerns, tech issues, and a huge thanks for to my colleague Shelby for being here today and helping us get through. Have a great weekend, everybody. Thanks for joining us.